What you think about that? What you think about anything? What you think about you? What you think about me? What you think about that? What you think about that? What you think about anything? What you think about you? What you think about me? What you think about that? I get so sick and tired of faking all the moves. I know everything that comes between us. I'm gonna let you stew.
Well, throughout this series, you have sent us very thoughtful, honest, and sometimes painful questions, including this week. How do we find hope when we feel hopeless? Where is God when terrible things happen to us? Have you ever asked that question? How do we understand things like the death of a child? Oftentimes we get this question, is suffering part of God's plan? Or how can a loving God allow so much cruelty? You know, these questions that you've asked are not abstract theological questions. They come from hospital rooms and funeral homes and broken relationships, unanswered prayers, traumatic experiences, and futures that just didn't work out as we thought they would. These are the questions that we ask when life, as we are experiencing it in the moment, no longer fits what we've been taught to believe. And you know, underneath all of these questions about God and faith and suffering and hope is a certain understanding of how we believe God, faith, and life are supposed to work. And those understandings create certain expectations. So, for example, if you or I were taught that God controls everything, then we have an expectation that God will prevent terrible things from happening. Or if we're taught, let's say, that God individually plans every event of our lives, then we expect everything that happens to contain a specific kind of divine purpose. And if maybe we're taught that prayer, faithful prayer, will change circumstances, then we tend to expect that if we pray the right prayers, then we'll get the right outcomes. Or maybe you were taught that faith protects you, and then you expected faithful people to be spared from really painful suffering. But then something happens that doesn't fit those expectations, right? In our lives, a child dies, or the treatment fails, or a relationship ends, and the prayer appears to go unanswered. Or maybe a faithful person suffers, and suddenly we're not only grieving really about what happened, but we're trying to reconcile it with everything that we believed about God, right? So where was God? Could God have prevented this? Why did God allow this to happen? Was this part of God's plan? Can God be both loving and powerful? Sometimes we even ask questions like, is God even present at all? You know, these aren't faithless questions. They're honest questions of people whose expectations of God and faith and life have just collided with the realities of human existence. And the problem may not be that we have failed to believe strongly enough. The problem may actually be that some of our understandings, the things we were taught, and the expectation that they produced were never aligned with reality or with lived experience of all of humanity. Life is beautiful, yes, but it is also vulnerable. Bodies, they become sick, and accidents happen. Natural processes don't distribute suffering according to who deserves it and who doesn't. Human beings possess genuine agency, and human beings use that agency to heal and to harm. Love doesn't make us invulnerable. Faith doesn't give us control. Prayer doesn't guarantee a particular outcome. If you live long enough, you'll see good people suffer. Children, they die sometimes. Grief changes us. if our faith requires us to deny these realities, the truth is that faith will eventually become fragile. And if our understanding of God requires us to call every tragedy part of a perfect plan, then God will eventually appear cruel. But maybe the problem isn't God. Perhaps the problem is the way that you and we've been taught at times to understand God's power and God's plan, to think about those things. And so today what I want to do is kind of offer a different foundation for thinking about God and faith and suffering and hope, a foundation that can help us answer these questions well. And it's the central conviction that kind of holds this talk together, and that's this. Not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. Right? Not everything that happens is good. Not everything that happens is necessary. Not everything that happens was arranged by God. Not every tragedy contains some hidden divine purpose. When we experience violence, it's okay to say the violence wasn't God's plan, or the cruelty wasn't God's plan, or the death of a child wasn't God's plan. But God's plan for everything that happens is love. Love that comes near. Love that grieves with us. Love that resists cruelty. Love that protects the vulnerable. Love that gathers what has been broken and begins the work of redemption. Not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. That's the core. That's the core of the message. Now, that conviction, it doesn't answer every question or remove the mysteries from life. But it does give us a way of understanding God that doesn't require us to defend cruelty in order to preserve our faith, right? It also gives us expectations that are better aligned with reality. You know, we can expect life to contain joy and suffering. We can expect human freedom to produce beauty and harm. We can expect our bodies and the bodies of the people we love to remain fragile and vulnerable. You and I should and we can expect grief to be real, but we can also expect God to be consistently loving. We can expect divine love to meet us within that reality, that complexity. We can expect love to help us find a way forward. And we can expect violence and death not to have the final word. And that brings us to a road outside Jerusalem. There's a story in the Gospel of Luke of two disciples that are walking towards a village called Emmaus. Now, a few days earlier, these two followers of Jesus, disciples, they were witnessing the beginning of a new world. They had followed Jesus. They had heard him speak all about the kingdom of God. You know, they had watched Jesus heal people. They had watched Jesus welcome outsiders, confront injustice, challenge systems of domination. And the truth is, they believed Jesus was going to redeem Israel. They had imagined a future, but Jesus was arrested, he was tortured, and executed by the Roman Empire. And with his death, the future that they imagined died too. And as they walked away from Jerusalem, all of a sudden, Jesus comes near and walks with them, but they don't recognize him. And he asks them what they're discussing, and they stop walking, and Luke tells us that their faces are sad, and they tell this stranger, because they don't recognize Jesus, what happened and what they had expected. And then they say the words at the center of the story, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." But we had hoped. We had hoped the treatment would work. We had hoped the relationship would survive. We had hoped the child would recover. We had hoped that our prayers would change the outcome. We had hoped that life would be different. You see, these disciples, they've not merely lost Jesus, right? They lost this future that they believed Jesus represented. Their grief is emotional, but it's also theological. What they experienced, it didn't fit with what they had expected from God. And that's precisely where Jesus meets them. Not after they have resolved all their doubts and not after they have recovered their faith and everything's all good. No, Jesus meets them while they're walking in their grief, in their questions, in their disappointment, while they're walking away. Now, before we try to answer these big questions about hope and suffering, God's power, God's plan, I want to offer a few foundational convictions for us to consider. These are convictions that I hold, and the travelers on the Emmaus Road can help us unpack each of them. Now, these statements, they don't remove all mystery. They don't provide easy answers to tragedy. They just help me develop a consistent understanding of God and faith and life, one that doesn't collapse under the weight of reality or the depth of human suffering. These kind of presuppositions can give us a foundation from which we can grieve honestly, question freely, think humbly, and still find a meaningful path towards hope. So let's begin with the first statement. Divine power is love, not control. The disciples that day, they had a particular expectation of divine power. They expected the Messiah to defeat Rome, restore the nation, and establish this visible kingdom. They believed divine power would look like control. God would take charge. God would defeat the enemy. God would prevent the worst from happening. But the worst happened. Jesus was crucified, right? If divine power means controlling every person in every event, then the cross appears to be the biggest failure of God. But what if Jesus came to reveal a different kind of power? See, Jesus didn't conquer through violence. He didn't dominate his enemies. He didn't force people to follow him. See, what Jesus reveals is divine power through love. A powerful love that heals and welcomes and forgives and confronts injustice. Love that remains faithful even when it's rejected. And when human violence killed Jesus, God didn't respond with greater violence. Love, God responded with resurrection. The resurrection story is not the triumph of control. The resurrection story is about the triumph of love. It's the declaration that violence can wound love, but it cannot ultimately defeat love. Death can take a life, but death cannot have the final word. And this gives us a different expectation of God. You see, I expect God to be all loving, not all controlling. Now, that doesn't solve every mystery, like I said, but it frees us from having to call cruelty good in order to defend the idea of God. We don't have to believe that God planned the death of a child. We don't have to believe that God sent the disease or caused the accident. We can call tragedy tragic, and we can call suffering painful, and we can call death an enemy, and we can call cruelty evil, and we can trust that God is present as love within it. See, not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. God's power isn't revealed by controlling every little event, but it's revealed through love's refusal to abandon us with inside any event. See, divine power is the power to remain and sustain and heal and resist and create new possibilities where suffering has narrowed the future. Divine power is love, not control. Secondly, love is the plan. The disciples believed God's plan was supposed to produce a particular outcome. Jesus was supposed to redeem Israel in the way they had imagined. That's how redemption was going to happen. And when Jesus died, that assumed plan, they just assumed it had failed. Many of us carry a similar understanding of God's plan. We imagine that God possesses a detailed script for every life, and every opportunity was arranged. Every interruption was intentional. Every loss was assigned. Every death occurred according to a divine timetable. And yeah, that understanding can feel reassuring when life is going well, but it creates an unbearable problem when terrible things happen. If everything is individually planned by God, then cruelty must also be included in the plan. Right? I mean, if every death was scheduled, grief becomes a struggle not only with loss, but also with the character of the God who supposedly chose it. I don't know, perhaps God's plan isn't a script controlling every event. Perhaps God's plan is love. Love is the consistent direction of the divine. It's the purpose of the divine. It's the character of the divine. God's plan is not that everything happens for a reason at a timetable. God's plan is that love enters everything that happens. See, God's plan isn't the disease. God's plan is the love that surrounds the person who is sick. God's plan isn't the violence. God's plan is the courage that resists violence and protects the vulnerable. God's plan isn't death. God's plan is the community that grieves and remembers and carries one another. God's plan isn't a shattered heart. God's plan is the patient work of healing. And not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. And we see that plan embodied on the Emmaus Road, right? I mean, Jesus, he comes near, he walks with these disciples, he listens to their stories, he receives their grief. He helps them reconsider what has happened. And then at the end of the story, I love this, he sits at a table, he takes bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. You see, every movement in this story is just a movement of love. I'm sure Jesus didn't explain every detail or tell them to stop grieving. He just walks with them. Love comes near. Love listens. Love stays. Love nourishes. Love opens a future. The plan isn't some predetermined explanation for everything that happens that one day you'll understand. No, the plan is God's unwavering commitment to love within everything that happens, through you and around you. So even when we can't answer, why did this happen? We can ask, what does love require now? What needs to be protected, or what needs to be heard? What injustice needs to be confronted? What healing can begin? Here's the thing, we may never know why something happened, but we can know the direction in which God moves. And God is always moving in the direction of love. Third presupposition, love is present and redemptive in the inevitable pain and suffering of life. See, Luke tells us in the story, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Notice, Jesus is present, but they can't recognize him. And that may be one of the most compassionate details in the story. Because we all know that grief can make God seem absent. Trauma can alter our sense of safety, of meaning, of trust, of connection. Pain can make the world feel empty. Sometimes people feel guilty because they cannot sense God's presence. And we believe that our faith has failed. But the Emmaus story, it kind of suggests something different. It suggests that our inability to recognize the presence of God is not proof of the absence of God. Jesus is with them before they knew who he was, before they knew he was even with them. And notice what Jesus does first. He just asks, what are you discussing with each other while you walk along? He invites them into a conversation. He allows them to tell their stories. He doesn't interrupt with an explanation. He doesn't shame them. He gives them room to name what happened, what they lost, what they had hoped. Divine love listens. Divine love walks at the pace of grief. Divine love doesn't rush to turn suffering into a lesson. See, love is present in suffering, but that doesn't mean that love caused the suffering. No, love can redeem suffering, but that doesn't mean suffering was necessary. Redemption isn't the same thing as explanation, right? Redemption doesn't mean that the tragedy was secretly good, or that the suffering doesn't get this unlimited authority over the future, right? God doesn't make death good. God refuses to allow death to be final. And there are losses that cannot be undone within this life. And there are people we will always miss. There are wounds that just become part of who we are. And Christ-like hope, Jesus-centered hope, doesn't ask us to deny those realities. It assures us that loss is not the only reality present. Love is also here in those moments. Love appears through the friend who listens without trying to explain, and the community that provides practical care, the therapist who helps us survive, and the people who continue to remember with us. And none of that makes the tragedy good. It means the tragedy is not the only force acting on us, though. Not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. A love that is present, and a love that grieves, and a love that stays. And love begins this redemptive work of creating life within what has been broken. And so here's our fourth thought. Christian theology of hope is different from the psychology of hope. Right? When the disciples say we had hoped that he would be the Messiah, they were describing a collapse of their own hope. And it may help to distinguish between the psychology of hope and kind of a Christian theology of hope. So psychologically speaking, hope involves three elements, right? It means it has to have a meaningful goal, a possible pathway toward that goal, and a sense of agency, the belief that the person, you or I, can take steps along that pathway, that we can take action. And so hope is more than a wish. Like, I wish I win the lottery, but without a realistic pathway or meaningful agency, it's not strong psychological hope. Sure, I can have a lottery ticket, but it's not strong hope. And the disciples, though they had possessed all those elements, they had a goal, the redemption of Israel. They had a pathway. Jesus would lead that redemption. They had agency. They had joined the movement. But after the crucifixion, the goal appeared impossible. The pathway had disappeared, and their agency felt meaningless. So they walked away from Jerusalem. They just walked away. Now, a Christian theology of hope begins there in that moment where the personal goals and pathways and agencies, they reach their limits. See, Christian hope, Christ-like hope, is rooted in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's the conviction that violence and death don't have the final word. And Jesus-centered hope, Christ-like hope, Christian hope is not grounded in our ability to fix everything or our personal strength or the success of our plans. It's grounded in the character of the divine, which is love. And so psychological hope tells us there may be a meaningful path forward from here. And Christian hope says, even when I cannot yet see a path forward, love isn't finished. Christ-like hope doesn't replace psychological hope. We need both, but it creates a foundation beneath it. Theology gives hope its ultimate horizon. Psychology helps us move toward that horizon. The resurrection doesn't erase the crucifixion or make the violence acceptable. Jesus has still been killed. Their lives have still been changed. The future they imagined is still gone. But resurrection opens a future they could not imagine before. Hope is not always the recovery of the future we wanted. Right? Sometimes hope is the discovery that love can still lead us into a future after the one we wanted is gone. Hope may not mean returning to life as it was. It may mean discovering that another meaningful future remains possible. Not the same future, not an unscarred future, not a future that makes the tragedy worthwhile, but a future in which love remains present, where meaning can still grow and joy can eventually coexist with grief. Now, why can we trust that such a future remains possible? Because not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. The crucifixion was violence. The resurrection was love's response. Death happened, but death didn't determine the ending. So with those things, let's ask the question, how do we find hope when hope feels lost? That's the big question. How do we find hope when what we believed was God's plan has been crushed beneath suffering, death, and evil? How can we possibly move forward when the goal has disappeared, when the pathway is blocked and our agency feels small and diminished? Again, I would say that we have to first align our expectations with the reality of existence. The Emmaus disciples didn't simply need emotional comfort. Their expectations had to change. They expected God to act through recognizable power, control, and victory. Jesus doesn't restore their old theology. He helps them see God differently. Reality-aligned faith acknowledges that life is both beautiful and vulnerable. Bodies become sick, accidents happen. Human beings use their agency to love or harm. Good people suffer, and children die, and grief takes time, and grief is constant, and prayer doesn't give us control over every outcome. And through all of this, God remains consistently loving. A belief in divine consistency clarifies our expectations. I expect God to be all loving, not all controlling. I expect God to be present. I expect God to suffer with those who suffer. I expect God to empower us with compassion and courage and justice and healing. I expect God to work redemptively within the reality in which I live. And I expect death not to have the final word. And so faith becomes more stable when we stop expecting God to control reality and begin trusting divine love to meet us within reality. Not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. And that expectation doesn't prevent grief. It prevents our grief from being compounded by the belief that God deliberately caused the tragedy. Secondly, I want to encourage you to form a vision for the future. When hope is shattered, we may not be ready to imagine this wonderful future. And the question isn't necessarily, how can everything become good again? Some things can't be restored to the way that they were. Maybe a gentler question is, what do you want from the future despite your present pain? What do you still want your life to contain? What relationships do you want to preserve? What would healing look like? Not the erasure of the wound, but a life capable of carrying the wound. What would give your days a sense of meaning? For the disciples, hope began when a different future became imaginable. Their old vision had died, but the death of one future is not the death of every possible future. Love continues to create new possibilities. Next, identify the assets that are available to you. The disciples didn't walk alone. They had one another. They have a stranger who listens. They have their scriptures. They have a table, bread. They have a larger community that's waiting in Jerusalem. Hope is rarely an individual achievement. Sometimes other people hold hope for us until we're able to carry it again. And so what resources are available to support your vision in this moment? Are there friends and family? Do you have a faith community? A therapist? Do you have a physician, a support group, public resources, a mentor, someone who's walked a similar road? You see, hope grows when we recognize that we don't have to find the pathway alone. Love is often embodied in the people and resources around us, not the suffering. The love that helps us carry it, right? And that is beautiful. So focus on just the next step. At the end of the Emmaus story, the disciples don't receive a detailed map for the rest of their lives. No, they just recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread. He disappears from their sight, but something has changed. And they say, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road? And then Luke tells us that same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. They just took one next step. What's the next step you can take towards that vision? They just returned. Hope doesn't always mean knowing how the entire journey is going to unfold. Sometimes hope is just making one phone call, making one appointment, telling one person the truth, asking for help, returning to community, getting through one day. Hope doesn't always give us the entire path. Sometimes hope gives us enough light just for the next step. The disciples, they couldn't undo the crucifixion. They couldn't return the future that they once imagined. But they weren't powerless. They got up. They could return. They could tell the story. They could participate in what love does next. Here's the last thing. Reality-aligned expectations grow empowerment and endurance in us. By the end of the Emmaus story, the external world has not suddenly become safe. Rome remains in power. Jesus has still been crucified. The future remains uncertain. But the disciples' relationship to reality, that has changed. They no longer interpret the crucifixion as proof that love has failed. They no longer believed death had the final word. They got up and they returned to Jerusalem. See, reality-aligned expectations empower us because they help us distinguish between what we can and cannot control. We cannot control every outcome. We just can't. We can't prevent every loss. We can't make ourselves or the people we love invulnerable. But we can still respond. We can participate in healing. We can resist injustice. We can protect vulnerable people. Right? I mean, we can create community. We can take the next step. We can practice love. Empowerment isn't the ability to control everything that happens. Empowerment is the discovery that we can still participate in what love does next. This is where our central conviction becomes more than this theological statement. It becomes a way of living. I live in such a way, and I hold to this belief that not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. If love is the plan, then even when we cannot explain what happened, we can participate in healing. Our grief can coexist with meaningful action. We can resist the forces that produce unnecessary suffering. Every act of care and justice and courage and compassion participates in the work of God. It is the work of God. Reality-aligned expectations also grow our endurance. Endurance is not pretending everything is okay. It's not suppressing our grief or accepting injustice as part of God's plan. Enduring is remaining connected to life, to love, to community, and to meaning when our circumstances are painful and uncertain. Pain is real. Grief is real, and it's deep. And the future can be very unclear. And love still sustains us. So, what's next? Well, the Emmaus story helps us when we have shattered hope. They said, but we had hoped. And their hope continues with the presence of love. Jesus came near and went with them, it says, and it reaches its turning point. The story does at the table where Jesus takes the bread and he blesses it and he breaks it and he gives it to them. Luke tells us that in that moment their eyes were open and they recognized him. They recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Their circumstances didn't suddenly become easy. Rome was still in power. Jesus had still been crucified. They're still grieving. But at the table they discover that death has not defeated love. Violence has not ended the story. Hopelessness has not been given the final word. And that's why we come to the table today. Communion doesn't ask us to pretend everything is okay, to explain our suffering. It invites us to remember. We remember the life and love of Jesus. We remember that human violence crucified him, but violence didn't have the final word. We remember that death came, but death could not defeat love. The bread reminds us of love embodied, and the cup reminds us of love poured out for the world. And together they remind us that not everything that happens is God's plan, but God's plan for everything that happens is love. And so in just a moment, I want to encourage you to take some time, grab something that you can have for communion as this song is played. Take those elements, whatever you might have with you, and let them be the body, let them be the juice, the representation of the blood, the love that was poured out. And just reflect. Just reflect. Don't take time to, I've got to figure out all the theology. I got to be free from doubt. No, just welcome in hope. If you're feeling hopeful, you're welcome. If you're feeling hopeless, you're welcome at the table. If your faith feels strong or fragile, you're welcome at the table. If you are grieving, questioning, angry, or simply just trying to take the next step, you are welcome at the table with Jesus. It's the table of divine love. And this song really does reflect this idea that when hope feels lost, when we feel like a future has disappeared, that prayer seems unanswered, while that loss can change you, it doesn't have to define us. You don't have to force an answer or manufacture hope. We can simply be honest about where we are. And we can recognize that there is no mountain that love doesn't climb. There is no valley that love doesn't run through. There's no place where love isn't with us. And that is the hope that is offered to us. Not the hope that we will avoid every mountain or every valley. Not the hope that life will always follow our plan. No, it's the hope that there's no grief or question or place of suffering where divine love refuses to meet us. The travelers on the Emmaus road, they couldn't recognize Jesus while he walked beside them, but he was there. They couldn't see the entire path, but love gave them enough hope to take the next step. And so I hope during this song, as you reflect, you'll be reminded that love has come near, that love is present, that love is not finished. Violence will not have the final word. Death will not have the final word. Hopelessness will not have the final word. And so take these moments to reflect, to pause, to consider the power of love in the midst of all of our experiences. In this moment, you can bring your hope, your hopelessness. You can bring your faith, your faithlessness. You can bring your questions. There's place for it all in this moment.